Download Galatea now and get access to hundreds of books and audiobooks. Link in the description. Mira. Chapter 1. "Run, Mira," she heard her best friend yell. Mira looked behind her as she heard the growls getting closer and closer. Tears streamed down her face as they both kept running for their lives. They should have listened to their parents. They should have stayed closer to the cabin. If they had only listened, they wouldn't have been killed a few moments later. They would have had fun at the lake close to their vacation cabin. A scream pulled Esmeralda from her thoughts, and the two girls immediately came to a stop. She looked at the large wolf in front of her as he bared his teeth at the girls. This was it. They were going to die at the age of 14. She saw Kelly pick up a rock and throw it at the wolf in front of her. The rock hit his head. He growled again and stalked forward. Mira whimpered and took a step back. She didn't want to die like this. As she stepped, she heard a low growl behind her, which made her stop and turn immediately. 3 more wolves were behind them, and one was close to her. He looked at her, and she saw his amber-colored eyes. They were beautiful. She had never seen a wolf's eyes up close. Well, there was a reason for that. She had never been in a situation where she was about to get killed by one. His gray, almost white fur reflected in the sunlight, giving him an even more beautiful glow. The other wolves had dark brown pelts, and he was the only one who stood out. The sound of a twig breaking pulled her out of her trance. The next thing she knew, she was being grabbed by her wrist and pulled away from the wolves. The gray one tried to bite her but wasn't fast enough. Kelly pulled her further and they ran again. Mira pulled her wrist loose as they had to avoid a big boulder. As they ran past it, she heard a blood-curdling scream. She looked behind her and saw that Kelly had fallen. "Kelly!" Mira grabbed her arm and tried to help her up, but before she could, Kelly screamed again as one of the wolves grabbed her leg in his jaw and bit down. Mira grabbed a rock and threw it at his head. He yelped but didn't release Kelly's leg. She kept screaming as the wolf bit down even harder. Mira saw the other wolves getting closer and knew she had to act fast. She saw a stick and knew it couldn't hurt to try. She grabbed it, and before she could try to hit the wolf that held Kelly, she felt an excruciating pain in her right arm as her skin was ripped open from her shoulder to her wrist by a claw. She screamed as she felt her skin and muscles being torn open. Mira fell onto the ground and crawled backward as she saw the gray wolf run toward her. He had one bloody paw, and she knew he was the one who had injured her. She grabbed the branch in her left hand as the wolf ran toward her. When he was close, she gathered all the strength she had left and jammed the branch into his side. The wolf yelped as he felt the branch enter his body. Mira kicked her legs up and hit his lower abdomen. She crawled further backward. She had managed to kick the wolf further away from her. She stopped as she saw Kelly. Her breath stopped at the sight of her best friend. Her abdomen was torn, her guts were pulled out, and she was missing a leg. Her eyes were open, and she stared at the sky with the same fear displayed on Mira's face. Blood surrounded her body, and Mira knew she was dead. Mira screamed as she felt the pain of losing her best friend. Tears streamed down her face. She knew this would also be her fate. She heard a growl, and her attention was brought back to the wolves. The gray wolf was close again. She had to do something. She couldn't just lie down and die. She threw her leg up as he was close to her and kicked his head. He yelped. The other wolves reacted and also ran toward her. The gray one was closest. He attacked. She managed to evade his jaws, but the same couldn't be said for his claws. He sliced open the right side of her abdomen. She screamed at the pain but didn't give up fighting. She kicked him again but accidentally caused him to tear her already wounded arm open even more. The other wolves came closer, but before they could attack, she heard more growls coming from all around her, and they all stopped. Even the gray one. She felt her consciousness leaving her. She was losing too much blood. Her sight began to blur, and the only thing she could do was wait for death. But it never came. Instead, she saw a human-like figure appear in her sight. She couldn't see who it was, but from the voice she knew it was a female. "Hold on, little one, you're not going to die today. Just hold on," the female told her right before she passed out. Download Galatea now and get access to hundreds of books and audiobooks. Link in the description. Mira. Chapter 1. "Run, Mira! Kelly! Hold on, little one!" She shot up from her dream and hit her head against the car seat in front of her. She groaned as she rubbed her head and fell back in her chair. "Mira, you okay?" She looked at her brother, who looked at her in surprise. Mira knew he already knew that she'd had a nightmare about the attack again. She gave him a small smile and nodded. "I'm fine, Mitch," she said as she started massaging her aching arm. She looked at it, and even though the sleeves of her hoodie hid the scars, she still felt the pain from them. After the attack, the doctors did everything to try to salvage her arm. With a miracle, they pulled it off, but the cost that came with it was one she didn't want to pay. The pain she felt in her arm would never go away. Her nerves were severely damaged. They'd tried everything to take it away, but nothing helped. Because her arm was basically shredded, she'd also lost 50% of her mobility. Her entire skin was composed of scars. No smooth skin was left. They'd said she'd been lucky. Lucky. She was anything but lucky. Mira saw her best friend being killed. She saw Kelly being ripped to shreds, and that image would haunt her for the rest of her life. The guilt of not being able to save her was something she could never get past. A tear fell down her cheek. She quickly wiped it away and looked through the car window at the moving scenery. The attack had been 6 years ago, and she only remembered bits and pieces. She remembered seeing Kelly like she was looking at her right now. She remembered they were attacked by wolves, but she couldn't remember what they looked like or where she was attacked. She remembered seeing the reaction of 2 parents who heard their daughter had been ripped to shreds and had passed away. Mira hadn't seen Kelly's parents since the funeral. They lived in the village where she and her parents had rented a cabin for the holidays. It wasn't that she didn't want to go, but she didn't remember the name of the village. Sometimes she was glad she didn't, but at other times she felt guilty for never visiting her best friend's grave. Her parents knew, but she had always been too afraid to ask. Another tear rolled down and she brushed it away. She looked at the scenery and saw they had entered a forest. "Where are we going again?" she asked her parents. Her dad chuckled softly. "Our new home." Mira rolled her eyes. Her dad had been offered a new job in a remote village. Because of the pay, he took it and ultimately decided they had to move there. She didn't mind. A change of scenery and people was something she craved. After being the girl that was attacked by wolves for 6 years, she'd really had it with the city. The thing was, her parents hadn't told either her or her brother where they would be living. They'd just said, a village in the forest with a big city nearby. They always said it like it wasn't a big deal, but she and Mitch just thought it was weird. Afterward, her dad told them it was a surprise, and that was the reason they were being so shady. But it felt like there was more to it. Why else would you suddenly move to Norway? Not just because you get a job there, in her opinion. "Thanks for being shady, Dad," she commented eventually. He snorted and winked at her in the rearview mirror. She rolled her eyes and looked outside again. Truly, she had been excited when she'd heard they were moving to Norway. She had always loved the stories of Scandinavia, and she was excited to live there. They all were. "How long will it be until we're there?" Mitch asked. "Look ahead," their mother said. Mira and Mitch looked to the front and saw a village getting closer. They briefly looked at each other before they looked back. They'd got here faster than they'd expected. Mira took in the village as they drove through. It was nice. The houses were modern in style, but were made of beautiful different-colored wood and stone. There was a big fountain in the middle of the village. It was also the center of the village where all the shops were. It was a more open and softer-looking village than she had expected for a village in the woods. They drove on a little further, out of the village, and a beautiful cabin appeared. Their dad stopped the car and they all got out. "Welcome home," their mom said as she hugged her daughter. Mira gave her mother a small smile as they walked into the cabin. It was completely furnished, and just like in the village, there were modern features everywhere she looked. They walked to the first floor, and Mira was drawn to a door at the end of the hall. She walked to it, and as she opened it, a beautiful room was revealed. Her mom and dad looked at each other briefly before they looked back at her. She walked in. The bed was king-sized and had blue sheets. There was a desk with her laptop and a couch by the window with her accessories. Some of her drawings were hung on the wall as they had been in her old room. There was a huge walk-in closet filled with her clothes and also a mirror. The room had walls like the outside of the house, and the ceiling had a stoke near the wall, which was made of glass that merged with her windows to give it a more open feeling. It had an adjoining bathroom which she would have to share with the person who had the room on the other side of the bathroom. The bathroom had a separate shower, a toilet, and a beautiful sink with a large mirror above it. Everything was modern and white. The doors to the bathroom could be locked from the inside. The floor was made from black tiles and the walls from gray tiles. Mira got the feeling she'd been there before. She walked back into the bedroom and saw her parents and brother. "So I guess this is my room," she stated. Her mother smiled and nodded. "We weren't waiting for a fight about who gets which room, so we chose for you," her dad said. Mira and Mitch looked at each other and started laughing. "Let's go get the bags," her mom said as she and her dad walked downstairs. "Question?" Mitch started. "Do you also feel like you've been here before?" Mira looked at the room and nodded. "Yeah, but I don't know if we've ever been to Norway before," Mira answered. Mitch nodded as well. "You guys coming, or are you going to sleep in the car?" their dad yelled from downstairs. Mira rolled her eyes as she walked downstairs, followed by Mitch. She walked outside and saw her mom grabbing one of her brother's bags out of the car. Mitch saw this as well and immediately ran toward her to grab the bag from her. "Good day." Mira looked toward the left and saw people approaching, a male, a female, and 2 younger males about her age. "Hello," her mother answered as she walked toward the 4. Mitch and Mira briefly looked at each other. "I'm Mayor Adrian Mainskin," the older male said. He had short light blonde hair and was wearing a blue button-up shirt with black trousers and black formal shoes. His eyes were hazel and kind. "This is my wife, Sin." The female nodded at them with a smile. She had raven black hair which reached her thighs, green eyes, and she was wearing a blue pantsuit. "Have I seen her before? I feel like I know her." "And the 2 young ones are the interns. This is Edvin." Mira looked at the male next to the mayor. He had brown hair and blue eyes. He was wearing the same kind of clothes as the mayor and the other intern, but she could see his muscles through his button-up shirt. The other one wasn't without muscles either. He and Edvin were also wearing black trousers, but Edvin was wearing a white button-up shirt with a tie, and the other wore a dark green shirt with rolled-up sleeves and no tie. Mira looked at the other intern and noticed his blonde hair was held together in a small bun, and his dark brown eyes were almost as dark as hers. He had freckles which only made him more handsome. "And Ken," the mayor said as he pointed at the blonde intern. Ken's eyes met Mira's and he smiled at her. She returned the smile before she looked away and listened to her mother. "I'm Dina Pack. This is my son, Mitchell." Mitch walked to the front where their mom stood and nodded at the mayor. "And my daughter, Esmeralda." Mira gulped and walked toward her mother as well. They looked at her as she gave them a smile and nodded. The mayor looked her up and down like he was assessing her. When he met her eyes, he smiled and nodded as well. "And you already know my husband, Patrick." Mira looked to the side and saw her dad approaching. "Yes, the one I had to contact and persuade to take the job," the mayor said as he shook her dad's hand. Her dad chuckled. "It wasn't a job next door, but I'm glad we came to an agreement," her dad said. The mayor also chuckled. "I'm glad we did. You are just what the town needs, and I'm sure you'll feel at home in no time." "Welcome to Manna Verdner," Sin said with a smile. On hearing the name, another sense of déjà vu ran through Mira's body. She decided not to linger on it and moved on. Thank you, her mom said excitedly. There's a craft market tomorrow that the children of the elementary school will host. It's a school project. There will be different things you can make and items for sale made by the kids. They do it every year, and it's always a blast. I hope to see you there, Sin said. Mira could see she was enthusiastic about the market and immediately knew she was a good mayor's wife. Sin looked at her, and they smiled at each other. We will. Esmeralda loves to craft things, her mother said. Mira could have died of embarrassment at that moment. She looked at the other four and saw them all looking at her. You do? The mayor asked. I'll bet my life on it that I'm as red as a tomato right now. Yeah, I'm not very good though, she said. Sin chuckled and walked toward her. We'll see if that's true tomorrow at the market. Mira was surprised at her remark. Sin gave her a wink and walked back to her husband. We'll leave you to unpack. It was nice to meet you, and we'll see you tomorrow, the mayor said. Her mother and father shook his hand, and he glanced at her as they walked away with the interns. Download Galatea now and get access to hundreds of books and audiobooks. Link in the description. Mira. Chapter 2. Mira shot up as she heard a loud masculine scream. It came from the bathroom. She ran to the bathroom and pulled the door open. As soon as she saw Mitch naked, she yelped and turned around. Seeing her brother like that was one of the things she just didn't want to see. What the fuck, Mira? Why would you suddenly run in here? Mitch yelled from behind her. I heard you scream, she yelled back without looking at him. What do you mean? I didn't scream. Why would I be screaming? Mitch said. Mira didn't understand. She could have sworn she heard a scream. Sighing, she ran a hand through her hair. Maybe you dreamed it, Mitch said. Maybe I did, but why would a male be screaming in my dream? Now, get out so I can take a shower, Mitch said as he pushed her out of the bathroom, closed the door, and locked it. She walked back to her bed and lay down. She glanced at her clock and saw the red digits forming 10:35. She sighed and thought about the scream. It must have been a dream. There's no other explanation. Edvin. God damn it, Edvin, Ken yelled as he got up from the ground. Edvin laughed at his brother. Dude, that was the worst attack you could have done in that situation. Ken growled at him, which caused Edvin to laugh even more. What do you expect at 09:50 in the morning? Edvin didn't stop laughing. Ken leaped at him and pushed him against the wall with a hand on his throat. Edvin yelped at his sudden attack. He looked into Ken's eyes and saw they had turned amber. His wolf was close to the surface. Edvin closed his eyes and allowed his own wolf to rise. As he opened his eyes, they also turned amber, and he started to attack Ken. He punched Ken's lower abdomen, which caused Ken's grip on his throat to loosen. He reacted and pushed him away. Ken stumbled backward. They both growled. Ken leaped at him again, but Edvin evaded him without effort. Ken ran straight into the wall and fell backward on the ground. Edvin quickly got on top of him and grabbed his throat. He pushed a little so Ken was forced to stay down. Killing each other again? Edvin looked at the door and saw a male with ginger hair and blue eyes. He was wearing jeans, a plain black t-shirt, and combat boots. He was just as muscled as Edvin and Ken. You know us, Axel. Axel shook his head and snorted. Sadly, I do. Let him go, Edvin. Alpha needs us. Edvin got off Ken. They both grabbed their shirts and walked after Axel. Any news about him? Ken asked. Axel sighed and shook his head. Ken also sighed as he put on his shirt. Seriously? Doesn't he want to be Alpha or something? Ken asked. Dude, you know he's a complicated guy. He's been through a lot, Edvin said. Axel looked at him. And we haven't? That day changed us all, Edvin. He's the Alpha's son. He needs to grow up and take his place. Yes, he was broken, but he needs to move on like we have. Seriously, have we moved on? Ken asked. Axel and Edvin looked at him.
Luna still reminds us of it every year, and every time she does, I feel like I did that day. We let it happen, and now it's something that will haunt us. It's only natural he's reluctant to take his place as Alpha, Ken said. Axel sighed and didn't respond. The three walked in silence toward the office and walked in. Alpha Adrian looked up from his notes and removed his glasses. Alpha, the three greeted. I'm organizing a search for my son, Adrian started. Axel, Edvin, and Ken looked at each other briefly. It's been 3 months. He needs to come home and accept or officially reject the position, Adrian said. He stood up from his desk and looked out the window. I'm putting you three in charge of the 3 search parties. He turned back to face them. You won't stop until you find him and bring him back. Understood? The 3 stood a little straighter and nodded. Where will each of us start? Axel asked. You will start at the western border of the pack. Edvin will start at the eastern border and Ken at the southern border. I will appoint my beta, Vigo, to search at the northern border. You will start at the edge and continue for as long as it takes. Don't cross territories or kill any rogue. He stopped. The sound of a blood-curdling scream filled the air. It came from the northern side of the forest. Go! Adrian commanded the 3, and they ran out of the pack house and toward the scream.
Mira. After breakfast, Mira went upstairs and took a shower. She remembered Sin talking about the market, and she was excited they had a craft market every year. She had always loved crafting things, and drawing was one of her favorites. Even though she could barely move her arm, she could use it to draw, and she was forever grateful for that. After a short shower, she got out and dried herself. Her eyes went to the mirror. The scars on her arm were the first thing she noticed, and immediately the image of ripped-open Kelly appeared in her head. The scars covered her entire right arm, shoulder, an area of her collarbone, and her shoulder blade. Her hand was basically unharmed, besides some small scars that were barely visible from a distance. She looked at her abdomen and saw the claw marks on her right side. An image of the wolf cutting her appeared in her head, and a tear slipped out. She shook the images out of her head and dried her tear. The time for feeling sorry for herself was over. She needed to move on. She wanted to move on. All the crying she'd done had never helped, and she didn't want it anymore. She walked into her room and dressed in some black underwear, blue jeans, a blue top, and a black pullover of which the torso was see-through, and the sleeves weren't. The scars on her shoulder blade and collarbone were visible, but they weren't obvious. She brushed her golden blonde hair, which reached her lower back, and decided to let it hang loose. She looked at herself. Her dark brown eyes were almost black. She had all the right curves, and she was happy with her body. She grabbed her combat boots and put them on before she walked downstairs. Her mother was sitting at the dinner table, drinking her coffee as her father finished his 3rd breakfast. I'm gonna go to the market. I have my phone, so if you get there, you can let me know. Mira yelled at them as she walked to the door. She heard her mother chuckle. Sure, sweetie, have fun. Mira smiled at her mother before she walked out of the house and went to the village. It didn't take long before she arrived, and she was soon surrounded by people who were all in a festive mood. She smiled at them and felt like she belonged already. She walked in the direction of the square and saw the stands. There were kids running around handing out flyers, and others were sitting at stands and crafting. Some were drawing, others were sculpting. There was also pottery, and some were making wicker baskets. If there hadn't been signs they were living in 2020, she would have been sure she was living in the Middle Ages. A kid ran toward her. Mira smiled at the boy that stopped in front of her. Are you new here? She smiled at the boy's question. Mira crouched down so she was at the same height as he was. I am, she said. Where are you from? He asked her. She had to give it to him. He was curious. I lived in America before moving here. You've come a long way then. She got up and looked at the male behind her. Mira smiled and saw the resemblance between him and the boy. They both had light brown hair, gray eyes, and the same nose. The male was built strong, and she could see the muscles underneath his shirt. I'm Vigo, the mayor's deputy, and that nosy little boy is my son, Reuben."
"I'm not nosy," Reuben said as he stomped his foot on the ground. She smiled at the boy before looking back at Vigo. "Esmeralda, you can call me Mara."
"Nice to meet you, Mira."
Vigo smiled and held out his hand for her to shake. It was his right hand, and she knew it would hurt to shake it. She clenched her jaw and shook it anyway.
Every move she made hurt, and she had trouble not showing her pain.
"Are you okay?" Vigo asked.
She smiled at him as she released his hand and massaged her arm. "I'm fine. My muscles ache a little."
"Actually, it hurts a lot, but he doesn't need to know that."
He nodded in understanding. She felt someone pull at her shirt and looked at Reuben. Mira crouched down again. "Why are you here?" She smiled at Reuben's question as she heard Vigo sigh. "My dad is the new doctor here. He had to move here, and so did we," Mira explained to the boy, who nodded. "Are you a wolf too?" Mira looked at him in surprise as she heard the question. Vigo immediately grabbed his son. She got up and gave him a questioning look. "He thinks we are all humans with wolf spirits. They are learning about the Ulfhednar in history class, and he's taking it a little too literally," Vigo said as he lifted his son in his arms. "The Ulfhednar?" Mira asked, a little embarrassed at not knowing much about the history and myths of Norway. The Ulfhednar were a group of specific Vikings. They were fierce, even more than the normal Vikings. Some said they were insane or psychopaths. They were from Norway and originated from ancient Norse religious rites. Every time they went into battle, they would dye their skin black, wear wolfskins, and even howl. At those times, they were more wolf than human, Vigo explained. She had never heard about them before and was fascinated by the story. It was almost a werewolf story without the humans actually turning into wolves. Or they did, but not with their body. Mira looked at Reuben and smiled at him.
"No, I'm not a wolf."
He gave her a sad look and nodded. She smiled at Vigo, who smiled in return. He looked over his shoulder and sighed. She looked past him and saw nothing that would have drawn his attention. What is he looking at? He looked back at her as he placed his son back on the ground.
"I have to go. It was nice to meet you, Esmeralda."
She smiled and nodded before he turned and walked to a large house, probably the city hall. She saw 3 males run toward it with someone in between them. Vigo also started running and they all disappeared into the city hall. What's happened? Download Galatea now and get access to hundreds of books and audiobooks. Link in the description. Mira. Chapter 3. Reuben pulled her toward his stand, and she saw all kinds of pottery in front of her. What she'd seen at the city hall was still running through her head, but she knew it was none of her business. Reuben walked behind the stand.
"Look, I made this just now."
He showed her a handmade vase. It was medieval Norwegian in style. The markings on it were beautiful, and it was big. Mira took it from him with both hands and had a closer look. Her arm ached again, but she ignored it for now. The vase was asymmetrical, and she couldn't believe that a boy had made it. He looked at her in anticipation, and she smiled at him. "You made this?" she asked. A $1 million smile appeared on his face, and he nodded. "It's beautiful, Reuben," she said, and somehow his smile grew even brighter, which made her chuckle. Mira went to give it back to him, but he shook his head. "It's for you." She looked at him in surprise. "But you don't even know me." He shrugged and looked shyly at his feet. Mira smiled and shook her head. She crouched down in front of him. "Thank you." He looked up, and the smile was back on his face. "Can I leave it here until I go home?" He nodded and took the vase from her. She looked at the woman who was also behind the stand. The older woman had short gray hair and was wearing simple clothing and an apron. She smiled and shook her head at the boy. "Reuben, you have some more pots to make. I think it will impress her if you show her what you can do." There was no need to tell him twice. Before she was even done talking, he sat at his place, put on his apron, and started to make something. The older woman walked over to Mira. This is your first day here and you already have an admirer. How do you do it? Mira snorted. I really don't know. The woman chuckled. I'm Hedda, one of the teachers at the elementary school. She held out her hand. Mira cursed in her head as she knew she had to use her arm again. I'm Esmeralda, but you can call me Mira, she said as she shook her hand. Pain shot up and down her arm, but she didn't show it. Welcome, Mira. I hope you enjoy the market, she said as she walked toward Reuben. Mira kept watching the boy for a while until her legs started to ache, and she decided to walk around a little. It was busy in the square, and usually she would have hated it, but here she loved it. No one knew who she was, and no one was giving her strange looks. She was normal here. Mira walked further and saw the city hall appear in her view. She walked toward it and saw a trail of blood leading up to the building. Following the trail with her eyes, she saw it led into the forest. Again, the image of Kelly appeared in her head. She closed her eyes and willed the image to disappear. What are you doing here? Her gaze shot to a ginger-haired male, and she didn't know how to react. He crossed his arms and glared at her. Dude, relax. This is Esmeralda. She's the daughter of the new doc that just moved here with his family, Edvin said as he appeared from behind the ginger-haired male. Mira saw the male relax a little when he looked back at her. I'm sorry, I'm Axel. My father is the mayor's deputy. Mira gave him a small smile. He must be Vigo's son and Ruben's brother. I saw that you brought someone in earlier, and when I walked by, I saw the blood trail. What happened? She asked. Axel looked at the trail and sighed. Someone was running in the forest and he accidentally walked into a hunter's trap. He's fine, but it was a close call. I would advise you not to go for a run in the woods right now, he added. She snorted at his advice. I don't go into the woods alone, she said. Both he and Edvin looked at her in surprise. Why not? Edvin asked. She really didn't want them to know what had happened to her all those years ago. She was finally free from all those looks. Mira sighed and ran her good hand through her hair. It's nothing. I just don't like going into the forest. Mira could see they weren't going to let it go, but for now, they'd have to. Some people just don't like it, a female said. Mira looked to the side and saw Sin, Vigo, and Ken walking toward her. She smiled at them. Are you enjoying the market? Sin said as she stopped in front of her. Very much so. Everything is very different from what I was used to in America. Everybody chuckled. A good different, I hope, Vigo said. Mira smiled and nodded. It is. In America, everybody only really cares about themselves and judges you just by looks. Here, everyone seems nice and lives their own lives. It's a welcoming change. You don't know how welcoming we are, Ken said as he roughly wrapped an arm around her shoulders and squeezed. She whimpered and clenched her jaw. Ken immediately released her. Her hand shot to her arm. What did I do? She shook her head. Nothing. She has some aching muscles, Vigo said. She looked at him and smiled. Sin chuckled. If anybody says that moving isn't a workout, they have never moved. Mira chuckled as well. Then she saw Axel and Edvin looking at her collarbone and knew they had seen her scars. I got them a while ago. Their eyes shot up to hers. How? Axel asked. Something happened, and let's just say it left a mark. The others were now also looking at the exposed scar on her collarbone. I'm guessing you don't want to talk about it, Ken said. Mira sighed and shook her head. It's not something I like to talk about. He gave her a small smile and nodded. Seriously, Dad, let me go. Everybody looked toward the sound. Mira's breath hitched for a second as she saw the male that Mayor Adrian was pulling toward the group. His muscles were perfect, not too big and not too small. His short and slightly curling raven black hair shone in the sun, and he was wearing jeans, a tight black long-sleeved shirt, and combat boots. She pulled her eyes away from him, and her breathing became normal again. What just happened to me? She looked back at the two and saw him looking at her. His eyes were beautiful, One was brown and the other green hazel. It was something she hadn't seen before, and she thought she could fall in love with his eyes alone. Fall in love? Seriously, what is happening to me? Mayor Adrian stopped walking, but the male didn't. He took a few steps closer to her until Sin cleared her throat, and they were both pulled out of the trance. Esmeralda, meet our son Killian. Killian, this is Esmeralda. She just moved here with her family, Sin said. Killian looked from his mother back at her. Mira gave him a small smile. Nice to meet you, he said. She gulped at hearing his voice. She had to pull herself together to react normally. You too. She could save her voice, but the fact that she felt herself heat up was something she didn't want to happen. Mira? Her head shot to her brother, who slowly walked toward them. She had never been so happy to see him. I've got to go. Sin smiled at her and nodded. Mira met Killian's eyes one more time before she walked away. She could literally feel their eyes on her back. What was that about? Mitch asked. She looked back at the group as they also started walking to the market. She cleared her throat and looked in front of her again. Nothing. Come on. She grabbed his arm and pulled him to the market.
Killian. How could you be so fucking stupid, Leon? Alpha Adrian yelled at his son as he grabbed some clean clothes and changed into them. His were soaked with his blood from the hunter's trap. He changed his shirt and was careful not to rip open the stitched wound. Normally he would heal in an instant, but the blade was drenched with wolfsbane, which caused the wound to heal slower. It would be healed in a few hours, but still, what did you expect? You know I don't want to be the alpha. Adrian sighed and ran a hand over his head. Seriously, Killian, I know that. But you also know that the pack could fall if I appoint another. You are the only one with alpha blood in this pack. It's you, or we risk the end of the pack. Killian changed his pants and cleaned his face. He leaned on the sink and looked at himself in the mirror. The eyes he'd always hated stared back at him, and he knew his dad was right. He sighed and turned to look at his father. Give me until the full moon. I'll make my decision then. Alpha Adrian sighed. I could also leave again. Adrian growled at his son. Fine, but you're coming to the market. Killian looked at him in surprise. Like hell I am, Killian stated. Yes, you are, Alpha Adrian said as he grabbed his son's arm and pulled him out of the pack house toward the market. Seriously, Dad, let me go, Killian said as he tried to pull his arm free. His dad didn't listen, and when he took another step, the most delicious scent filled his nose. It was the scent of the forest after a rainstorm. He looked at the source, standing with his best friends, Beta Vigo, and his mother. His feet suddenly moved on their own. Her blonde hair shone beautifully in the sun. Her body was perfect with all the right curves, and her brown, almost black eyes were beautiful and somewhat familiar. Have I met her before? No, I can't have. Where would I have met her if not here? His dad noticed the change and released his arm. Killian continued to walk further toward her, only stopping once he heard his mother clear her throat. He looked at her and wanted to growl. His mother had stopped him from claiming his mate. Esmeralda, meet our son Killian. Killian, this is Esmeralda. She just moved here with her family. Killian looked back at Mira and immediately knew why his mother had stopped him. She's human. Of course, I need a mate who is human. He saw her smile and couldn't help but smile back. Nice to meet you, he said. He could see her shivering at hearing his voice. He had to hold back a smirk. He needed to act as human as possible. You too, she said. Her voice was beautiful, and he knew he could listen to it for hours. Mira? He looked at a male who was slowly walking toward them. Killian noticed the change in Mira and wanted to rip the dude's head off. I've got to go. He saw his mother smile and nod. His eyes met Mira's one more time before she walked away. He looked at his mate and his eyes wandered to her ass. Dude. He got an elbow in the ribs and groaned as he looked at Axel, who was grinning at him. So, you found your mate, Edvin said. Killian looked at her and saw her quickly turn her head back as they also started walking toward the market. It would appear so.
Download Galatea now and get access to hundreds of books and audiobooks. Link in the description. Mira. Chapter 4. Mira sat at the campfire. She looked at the dancing flames and enjoyed the sound of burning wood. The market had been a fun experience. The vase she got from Ruben had a nice place in her room, and he was incredibly happy when he saw it there. Afterward, they'd had dinner, and now they were here. It was June, so the weather was still pretty nice. They were living in the middle of Norway, where there were still some forests. If they went further north, they'd be able to see the northern lights. That was definitely one thing she was going to do. Maybe even more than once. She'd only been there for a day, but she knew she loved the place already. She felt more at home than she'd ever felt living in Utah. It was like something woke up in her bones, and she just knew this was where she belonged. Her eyes were drawn to the dark forest, and she heard an owl. A shiver went down her spine, and she immediately looked back at the fire. She hadn't been lying when she told the guys she didn't like going into the forest and that she wouldn't go in alone. Ever since the attack, she'd been reluctant to go into them, and she knew it was a fear she wasn't going to shake anytime soon. "Mira!" Mira jumped a little in her seat and looked startled at her mother. "Where were you with your thoughts? I've called your name like 10 times, she said as she gave her daughter a cup of tea. "Sorry, I was just daydreaming, nothing more." "About the mayor's son, probably." Mira choked on her tea and coughed it up while she spilled the rest over her pants. "Oh, tell me more," her mother said playfully as she looked at Mitch. "No, he will not tell you more because there is nothing to tell," Mira intervened as she put down her now empty cup and dried her chin with her shirt, which was also wet. Mitch started laughing. Mira glared at him before she kicked him from his chair. "Asshole!" "Seriously, what is up with the mayor's son?" Mira looked at her mother. "Nothing. I met him once and we barely talked. He looks like he's a brat that gets whatever he wants, and you know I hate that. So there truly is nothing to tell." She could have sworn she heard a growl from behind her, and she looked into the dark forest. A shiver went down her spine as she got a feeling that someone was watching her. "I didn't know they had a son." Mira's attention was pulled back to her mother. "Yeah, they do apparently. I'm gonna go change my clothes," she said as she stood up. Something inside of her wanted to get inside the house as fast as possible. "Why?" Mitch asked as he sat on his chair again. She glared at him and saw the grin on his face. "Because some asshole made me spill my drink, but trust me, he'll regret it," Mira said and walked inside the house. She went to her room and locked the door behind her. The window faced the forest, and she slowly walked toward it. "This is silly, I have nothing to worry about. My parents would never bring me somewhere there are wolves." Mira looked out of her window and saw nothing that indicated that there was something out there. She sighed and turned away. She grabbed her pajamas and walked to the bathroom to take a quick shower. She washed and dried herself and went straight to bed. She lay down and looked at the window again. There was indeed nothing to tell about Killian and her, but she couldn't deny that she'd felt weird when she saw him. It was as if the universe had decided to pull them together as Killian kept walking toward her. If it hadn't been for Sin, what would have happened? She closed her eyes and sighed.
Killian. "Okay, go check on her," his mother stated as she looked at him. Killian looked at her with a questioning gaze. "Honey, I'm glad you are back and all, but it feels like you left again as soon as you laid eyes on Esmeralda. Go check on her and come back so I can talk to my son and find out where he's been for all these months," Sin said. Killian sighed and fell back in his chair as he looked at the fireplace. "I'm sorry, it's just..." He groaned and ran his hands over his face. "Why does she have to be human? It makes everything so much harder." Sin and Adrian chuckled. "It's not that hard," Adrian stated. Killian looked at him. "Right. Where is Ruben and Axel's mom again?" Adrian sighed and looked at Vigo, who was also looking at him. Killian also looked at Vigo and saw the hurt look on his face. "Sorry, Vigo." Vigo sighed. "It's fine. You do have a point, though. Having a human mate is harder than having one who is a werewolf like us. Werewolf or no werewolf, she is still his mate, and there is nothing he can do about that but accept her. Besides, Mira not being a werewolf may be a good thing for him, Adrian said before he took a sip of his whiskey. Why is that a good thing? Killian said, as he leaned his head against the chair he was sitting on. It means you can redeem yourself. The gods want you to be alpha, Leon. Giving you a human mate shows that, Adrian said. Killian sighed and shook his head in disbelief. Typical of my father to find something in my life and turn it around to have it work to his advantage. That was one thing he hated about his father, but it also made him a great alpha. Something he thought he could never follow. Yeah, Dad, I'm sure Odin wouldn't care if I'm alpha or not, he said as he closed his eyes and sighed. Who was that other male, though? Killian opened his eyes and, like everyone else, he looked at Axel. That was the question that was also going through his mind. The fact that his mate touched him and ran to him as soon as she saw him was one thing for which he still wanted to kill that male. My mate should react to me like that, not some other male. A growl erupted from his throat. Ken and Edvin looked at each other and tried to hold in their laughter. Killian saw their faces and noticed how much they were trying not to look at him. He got up and walked to the two. Talk, he commanded. He's her brother, dude, Edvin said with a chuckle. Killian groaned and walked back to his chair. I just wanted to kill the brother of my mate. Yeah, this whole bond thing is going to be fun. Sin also laughed and got up to walk to her son. She cupped his face and looked him in the eyes. Go to her, but don't show yourself. Observe what she is like and let the bond do the rest. Being close to each other only strengthens it. He gave his mother a smile as she pulled away, and he got up again. He walked out of the pack house and a little into the woods. He stripped off and shifted into his wolf. He followed Mira's scent, still lingering in the air, and walked to a cabin just outside the village. He made sure to stay hidden in the forest as he saw a campfire. Sorry, I was just daydreaming, nothing more. Her voice filled his ears, and he had to restrain himself from running to her and marking her immediately. He got a little closer and saw Mira, her brother, and her parents. He felt like he'd met the whole family before. Why does this feeling keep resurfacing? About the mayor's son, probably, he heard her brother say, and Mira choked and spilled all of her tea as she coughed. He chuckled slightly, which sounded like a really low and soft growl. He knew it was because of the effect she had on him. Seriously, what is up with the mayor's son? Her mother asked after Mira kicked her brother off his chair. Killian was also curious and wondered what she would say about him. Nothing. I met him once and we barely talked. He looks like he's a brat that gets whatever he wants, and you know I hate that, so there truly is nothing to tell. Killian couldn't help but growl at her comment. He saw her look in his direction and cursed himself for growling. Does she really think about me like that? That was a good first impression then, one I have to fix. He zoned out of the conversation and just looked at his mate. She truly was perfect, and he badly wanted to hold her in his arms. He saw her get up and walk toward her room. Her heartbeat had quickened since the growl. He thought it was because of the bond, but the way she ran to her room showed that it was something else. He slowly walked to the back of the house while staying hidden and saw her looking out her window. She's afraid of something. She's afraid of the animal that growled. He heard her turn on the shower and not long after saw the light in her room go out. He sighed and ran back to the pack house. Axel was sitting on the porch and saw Killian as he shifted and walked toward him. He threw some sweatpants at him. Killian snorted and put them on. And, is she everything you ever hoped for? Axel said as he and Killian walked inside. You know she is, dude. She just thinks I'm a brat, and when I accidentally growled she was terrified, and she didn't know how fast she had to go to her room, he said, as he took a sip of water from the bottle Axel had given him. Maybe she is afraid of wolves. She also doesn't like to go into the forest, and she said she would never go into them alone, Axel said. Killian sighed and leaned on the table. Another thing which makes having a human mate harder, Axel snorted. Freya doesn't choose our mates because they are easy. She chooses them because we belong together, he said as he tapped Killian's back and walked away. He does have a point. The goddess wouldn't just put anyone together without being sure. Have fun in the shower, Axel added. Killian rolled his eyes at the comment, but also knew that he wouldn't be able to sleep if he didn't. He sighed and walked to his room.
Mira. Mira twisted and turned in her bed, but sleeping was something that wasn't happening. Her thoughts constantly went to Killian, and she didn't know why. She got up and walked to the kitchen. She grabbed a bottle of water and took a sip. She looked at her arm and sighed. This time it wasn't her nightmares forcing her to have a broken night. It was a male she'd met once. She walked to the couch and turned on the TV. The news channel came up and the lady was talking in the language she still needed to learn. Why do people here speak in English when it isn't their first language? She zapped through the channels until a movie came up. It was an old one that she hadn't seen before. She wouldn't usually watch movies like this one, but it was the only thing that was on with English actors, so she didn't have much choice. She sighed, grabbed a blanket, and blankly watched the movie with Norwegian subtitles, but her thoughts constantly went to him. Why can't I get him out of my head? Download Galatea now and get access to hundreds of books and audiobooks. Link in the description.